And without further ado now, I'd like to turn the mic over to Jeff Hall.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Jackie. It's great to be here this morning. Hope everyone's enjoying the spring weather. And we are this morning talking about the Plymouth assets and properties, building and land. I guess it's really kind of started with the growth task force that reached out to the congregation and tried to envision growing Plymouth mission and programs over the last 2-3 years, getting a lot of input from the congregation and different boards. And then about 2 years ago, someone approached us about buying one of our parking lots on the east side there, this little lot that we ended up selling, but maintaining parking rights in perpetuity there. So that brought up the question among the deacons, well, why are we selling the parking lot? And let's look at all the land we have and make sure we're using it in the way that we would like to. We decided to sell the parking lot because it was consistent with our mission, and the nonprofit that came in there and wanted to use that as part of their renovation of the neighboring building there. And it really kicked off this continuing effort to think about Plymouth and the future Plymouth. And we're going to share with you today kind of what we've been working on the last 6 months to a year, kind of pulling together some history, but then really in asking you to engage in the conversation of what do we all envision as the highest and best use for our Plymouth assets, our building and our land. How can it best be used for the mission of our church and the benefit of the neighborhood? So with that, I think we'll get into our PowerPoints, and it'll take us a few minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to get your thoughts on what we found so far and where you think we should be going as a church. Brian, do you want to start the PowerPoint?
Good. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'll launch our slides here, and then we'll just get going on this. So we're calling this our strategic campus plan, really because it is about the entire Plymouth campus, as Jeff mentioned, buildings, the land we own. So we'll do a little walk through some of the history, not only the history of the church, but also the history of the land prior to the church, which really, as you know, goes back a long time, because it's important that we also consider all that. Okay. So the goals are really established under the guidance of the purposes of the church. And we start the purposes by saying we humbly seek and serve God within, among, and beyond ourselves. And the purposes are really what we are called to do as a church. So that is really the framework for all the work. And it's also the framework for the Growth Task Force Visioning document, which you may not be aware of. That work was done shortly before the pandemic started. So there really hasn't been an opportunity to roll that out to the congregation, but that work has really started, and the boards and committees of the church will be doing a lot of the work this year, and you as the congregation will also be heavily involved in that work as it progresses. And there's a lot of information that needs to be distributed about that, but it's an excellent document. It's on our website. It's been on the website for some time, so some of you may have read it. I encourage you to read it because it really does outline where we want the church to go over the coming years. And then the question, of course, is how this relates to our building and our property. So just a brief summary. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Growth Task Force document, but there were 10 areas for recommendations for growth and change in that document. And they are these 10 things. And those are growth and community and fellowship within, personal spiritual development, growth and use of our physical space and assets, which relates directly to this work we're doing here, communication within, social justice efforts, radical hospitality and service, growth in our worship service, growth in name recognition and awareness, financial security, and connection with our neighborhood. And the interesting thing was, as we looked at this work about our building and our physical assets, we recognized that work really touches on 5 or 6 of these different areas. So it really became an excellent way to start the work on implementing the growth task force recommendations. It really becomes a center of the conversation as we talk about this. And one of the other recommendations was to build a marketing communications committee, develop a marketing communications plan, and a coherent practical communications campaign. Now, one of the things about the growth document, now I'm going to read just one small piece of it to kind of outline what the thinking was. And that is, in more fully living our purposes, Plymouth's light may shine in a way that may have the happy consequence of attracting new members and encouraging sustained and robust participation. So if I can paraphrase, the growth task force basically said, let's try to live out our purposes better. And my shorthand is, we become a better church. The marketing committee's job then is to tell people about it, is to make sure that people know about the work that we're doing and the kind of church that we are and are becoming. So this is just a brief overview. We started, as Jeff said, with reviewing historical ownership of the property, the history of the land. In the short term, we want to make the building more welcoming and implement the growth plan, which is a large long-term task. And then more active strategic use of our property, and also potentially have a capital campaign to support some of the recommendations that might come out of that. So I'm going to just walk through a history of the land. I'm not a professional historian. There may be some of you out here today who know a lot more about this than I do, but it's just a good review of kind of the history. Last week, Tom Weber, in his presentation on his book about Minneapolis, the urban biography, talks about how there's evidence of human occupation in our area going back about 6,000 years. So there's a very long history of indigenous occupation of the land that our church currently sits on. And obviously the history will extend far into the future. So, you can look at it by saying we are temporary occupants of the land. And goes back to, in the 1700s, the first European traders and missionaries entered the area. The Louisiana Purchase gave us the rights to negotiate with tribes to either purchase their land or to take it outright. We did both. In 1805, there was Zebulon Pike struck a treaty with the Dakota to build a fort, build a military establishment here in Minnesota, which ended up being Fort Snelling, and it included about 100,000 acres of land, which does include present-day Minneapolis. And it's generally considered that treaty was not valid and was superseded by other treaties later on. In 1820, Fort Snelling was established, and the other really significant treaties were in 1851, and that was when 2 treaties were signed at Traverse de Sioux, which is near St. Peter, and in Mendota, around Pilot Knob, which ceded most of southern and a good part of western Minnesota to the U.S. government. They had a war with Dakota in 1862, primarily caused by the fact that we didn't honor the agreements we made in 1851, and the Dakota were sent off to some small strips of land where they couldn't sustain their people, and they were hungry, and their payments were late, and so there was a skirmish between Dakota warriors and farmers, and it turned into a war. The Dakota were later, Alexander Ramsey's words, to be exterminated or completely removed from the state of Minnesota, and they essentially were removed for the most part. In 1867, Minneapolis became a city. That was 10 years after Plymouth became a church. 1870, Dakota people began to return to Minnesota, and then went through the boarding school era for over 70 years. And then in 1956, the Indian Relocation Act moved young adults back to Minneapolis and St. Paul to assimilate them into white culture. So you know, the what's interesting about this area is that the Dakota are the only tribe in this area that come from exactly this part of the world. Other tribes came from elsewhere, but there's also a long Ojibwe history here. But the land at where Fort Snelling is known as Bedote, which is a sacred place in Dakota. It's their creation story really begins there, and they're in fact, as Tom Weber said last week, to them, that area around Fort Snelling and Pikes Island is viewed much the same as Christians, Muslims, and Jews view Jerusalem, which is a really interesting comparison. So the land that the church sits on was ceded to the United States through those two treaties in 1851 for about $3.7 million or 12 cents an acre, but little of it was ever received. So it's good to know that those treaties really were not really negotiated in good faith. They were negotiated from a place of, that the United States negotiated from a place of power. The threat was always there that people could be removed, the tribes could be removed if they didn't sign the treaties. They didn't necessarily understand the documents that they signed. They were tricked into signing a document that gave much of this money to settle debts with traders. And also, it's really important to understand that the Dakota did not view land ownership the same way the Europeans did. They viewed the land as a relative, and you lived with the land, but you never owned it. And so it's probably likely that they didn't understand that they were giving away this land, their home, that they were giving it away forever, which is essentially what happened. So there have been a lot of problems with these treaties. They were not honored, and as I said, it led to a great deal of suffering among the Dakota tribes, which led to the Dakota War and a great deal of hatred for the Dakota people. So they are the people who really did own this land, and when people refer to this land as stolen land, this is really what they're referring to. And Dakota are now the largest Native community in Minneapolis and in our neighborhood, and about 45% live in poverty. You know, Tom Anderson, who was working with Mary Wolfing in the archives, sent this photo, and this is downtown Minneapolis in 1857. This is about the time that Plymouth Church started. And this is at Nicollet, around Nicollet and Hennepin, I guess down near Washington Avenue. And you see, this is 6 years after those treaties, and there's a Native encampment because they were not able to really live off the land. A lot of the game was gone where they had traditionally lived. So there were Native encampments right in downtown Minneapolis, which doesn't really seem all that long ago when you think about it. But I thought this photo was very interesting. So, you know, when you look at the history of Plymouth, well, you know, I kind of call this our march down Nicollet Avenue. We started in 1857 as a church and met in meeting halls in downtown Minneapolis. In 1858, we had our first building at 4th and Nicollet, which got burned down after 16 months because of Henry Nichols and his temperance sermons. People were upset about that. So for 3 years, Plymouth bounced around, finding a place to worship wherever they could. In 1863, they bought the land back. It had been repossessed at 4th and Nicollet and built a new church building. And in 1875, moved to 8th and Nicollet, where there's currently, I think, a Panera. if you ever get down there to visit, I think there's a plaque there, or there was a plaque. And then in 1909, we moved to 19th and Nicollet, where we are now. So we've obviously been in one place for a long time. But this was all these things were happening because the congregation was growing. The congregation was also moving. And it was felt that as people moved away from downtown, the church had to move closer to where people live. So that's how we ended up at the 19th and Nicollet. And there was another photo that Tom sent was, this is downtown Minneapolis in 1870. So looks a little different. This building right here, I hope you can see my cursor, is Plymouth's second building at 4th and Nicollet. We had that church for some time until 1875. This is Westminster over here. And I'm not sure which direction we're looking at, but anyway, there are so many, there's so many interesting documents and photographs that we have access to. But this was a couple of them, and times have very much changed. So this is where we are now today. And these are the parcels as they currently exist. But you can see this is all the land that we own. Now, we did own the land over here on the other side of Nicollet Avenue. We just sold that parking lot, but we really owned a good chunk of land over there at one time, and we've sold it off. These lots over here at 18th on the 1800 block, this is Nicollet Avenue, by the way, and this is north. The top is north. This is Groveland Avenue right here. These two lots, we used to own the land north of the shopping center, but then Red Owl wanted to come in and build a store. So we swapped those lots for these lots. And there was a house on the corner here that was used by Loring Nicollet Bethlehem for a short time, but we raised that and turned that into a parking lot. And then we bought land over on Pillsbury Avenue for Loring Nicollet Bethlehem to use, which they did use for some time. So we still own these two parking lots, totaled about 2/3 of an acre there. And then this big parcel is actually did not start off as one large parcel. It exists that way now. The original church that we owned was basically right down to about here. This square right here was what we originally owned. We bought that piece of land for about $40,000 in 1906 and moved our church in there. And this is the original building. The chapel and this area over here, this part of the building where the library is and the vocal lessons offices, that was all added on in 1948. There was a house that was just south of the chapel that we finally purchased from the Kidder family in 1958. And I think for quite a while, we used that as a library and as a housing for associate ministers and some meeting space. There used to be a Walgreens warehouse that sat right here, if you can see where the courtyard is and where the church offices are. And we bought that in 1954. And in 1967, we tore it down and we built the Kahn Fine Arts Center, which is all right in here. So, and many of you may remember these buildings. There was another office building just south of there, which is where this 1984 piece is, and the new education wing. That's just called the 1926 building. We bought that in 1984, and that was demolished in the 1990s to make way for the new education wing. This piece at Franklin and LaSalle used to have a house on it, but that house was torn down a long time ago, and that land was purchased in 1946 and became the upper parking lot. There used to be a set of stairs here leading down to the lower parking lot, but that was turned into a parking lot. And then in 1981, we bought the Jeans Standard Station on the corner of Nicollet and Franklin, and after some remediation, we tore that down, and that became a parking lot in about 1994. So, I mean, that's just a very brief summary. It's what really is clear through all this was that we were making a lot of property purchase in the mid 20th century because the church was growing. We were getting, the building needed to be bigger, and you know that our building started off, the traditional part of our building is relatively small compared to what we have now. It's been added on very piecemeal. And if you walk through our building, I think you'd probably see that it's like it was just added on to incrementally. And also we really needed to increase our parking. This was the time when the church was growing. Now the membership of the church, I believe, peaked in around 1977. So that has not been the case in terms of numbers for quite some time. But there was also a sense that Plymouth wanted to own its entire block, and we now do. We own the whole city block and then some. So, Jeff, I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Interesting history, Brian. Thank you. Become an expert. So as Brian mentioned today, we do own the entire block. We have a terrific location, very central to a lot of things, close to downtown, but easy access from other directions off the highway. Our neighbors and people passing by would say we have a very imposing building. Some people describe it like a castle. It's certainly beautiful, but I think to people who don't know it, it is imposing. And as Brian also mentioned, it's obviously been added onto and renovated over time. So it's a sprawling and complex building, and certainly first time visitors, it's very easy to get lost. And parking lots do comprise about 50% of our land. And as this next slide shows, the neighborhood's changed quite a bit, and there's a huge number of new apartments in the area. As you know, the last 10 years has been tremendous apartment growth throughout the whole country. And that's true in Minneapolis, and it's very true in our neighborhood. Younger folks want to be in neighborhoods that are walkable and near transit and other amenities like bars and restaurants and entertainment. And that's true in our neighborhood. Anybody who's been near Plymouth in the last few years, you can see new apartment buildings almost on every block in some sense. So I think there are about 2,500 new apartment units within, kind of half a mile or a quarter mile of the church. So that also means a lot of new people. So there's a great opportunity there. So as Brian mentioned at the beginning, we were looking at the purposes of the church and combining the thoughts from the growth task force. How can we increase the utility and the vitality of our building, the existing building that we have? How can we leverage it more? And then how can we make our building more welcoming to those in our neighborhood? And how can we promote among Plymouth people more connection, intergenerational connection and fellowship? So how can it become more of a community center, both within Plymouth itself, but then also the third point kind of beyond Plymouth and into the greater neighborhood in the city? How can we better utilize our campus to serve our mission of helping vulnerable people and working for justice? How can we, racial, economic, and climate justice are really critical Plymouth values and creating community. So these are some of the questions that come up as we think about how we can leverage our assets as a church to further our mission. And we're just at the very beginning of that. So this is where we really want as much input as possible from the congregation. We envision a conversation and back and forth over the next several years on these issues. And in terms of the short-term strategies for the coming year or two, we do want to initiate the marketing committee that the Growth Task Force recommended a year ago. And the marketing committee would be to help us, become more relevant for how people get information these days, which is mostly on their phone. And, Plymouth has really advanced a lot during the COVID with streaming services and digital services. But what else can we do, and how can we reach out to, just people in the neighborhood so they know that we're here, people moving into new apartments on our block and across the street. We really want to plan for an active summer in the parking lot. People are certainly eager to get together. We've got to start bringing the community physically back together when it's safe, as people get vaccines and starting in the parking lot. And then each Plymouth committee and board will continue to think about how the Growth Task Force recommendations impact their work. And we'll continue this is one of the many things we're doing to engage the congregation in this discussion. April 11th, there will be another opportunity to learn more about the growth plan from the Growth Plan Committee or the Growth Plan Task Force folks. And then as we look into the second quarter, the George Floyd anniversary is coming up in May. There's a Radical Hospitality Committee that has some recommendations. So we'll be looking harder at that. As we get into the second half of the year, we're considering hiring an architect to look at our campus plan. And in the short term, how can we make our building more welcoming? Not like a huge capital thing, but just, are there simple things we can do so that, you know, people feel free approaching Plymouth if they're not familiar with Plymouth? And then we'll do things over time where we'll come up with some design ideas and have a charrette where you kind of have some design ideas and people can come in and react to them and talk about them. And crowdsourcing ideas is another thing where people kind of brainstorm on how to optimize certain things. Like one of the growth task force plans was to have a kind of a coffee shop co-working space in the Jones Commons. It's a great large space to just bring people together. COVID obviously has pushed that off, but we can start to look at that again as we can start to see the end of COVID. So these are just some initial ideas, and nothing's in ink, nothing's been decided. These are ideas from the church, and we want to continue to get everyone's input as we move forward thinking about these things. Longer term is to continue. We've kind of done what we'll do for now on the history. We'll continue to do it parallel track with as we start to implement some of these shorter term ideas, because we want to continue to flush out the full research on the history of ownership, the native history, you know, we want to have some really good files in the church archive that it's been complicated to pull. There's a lot of great information, but it's been complicated to pull together. We want all the real estate stuff in one spot. And then we'll continue to research what kind of mission ideas make sense for our property. How can we better utilize our parking lots? You know, sort of thinking about our property. I mean, one idea is it's kind of this community center, and maybe it's more of an interfaith community center focused on justice, because a lot of things we care about are justice related: racial justice, economic justice, climate justice. And there are a lot of people that care about those things, not just people who are members of our church, but also neighbors of ours, and they can join us on those things, even if they don't want to join our church, but maybe they consider joining our church. And as we think about that, you know, we could certainly consider purchasing neighbor properties if we needed to. I'm not saying we have plans to, but, you know, we have the capability to think about things like that to really make our property and our activities a real center of ideas, and a center of people coming together, and a center where, you know, we can get economic development going as well. So there we go. Next steps. One of the short-term things will be getting the marketing committee going. So if you have marketing expertise or interest in this, please let us know. We don't have the committee together yet, and we're just starting at this point. We'd love to get some folks, especially if you have any advertising or communications or PR expertise. You don't have to, but please express your interest. And the idea here is just kind of refresh our brand, not to change our brand, but to refresh it for today and to communicate it in a way that's appropriate for today. And certainly leverage the fact that there's so many new people in the neighborhood, just so they know who we are and what we have, because a lot of them are going to care about the things we care about. And then again, each Plymouth board pursuing their aspect of the growth plan, and soliciting input from you, the congregation. So really eager to get your thoughts on all of this. And again, it'll be a multi-year conversation and dialogue back and forth. There's nothing in ink. This is all just the very beginning of a long-term process. And I think that's kind of the end of what Brian and I have to say, because really we want to get into what's on your mind and what do you think of this? So if you have any questions or comments, please add them to the chat, and Claire can help moderate us through any discussion.
So there's a comment from Jane Eichton in our Q&A window about saying she'd like to see a conversation begin with the Dakota people on how we can give at least some of this land back to them.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting conversation. You know, we live in a neighborhood where we have a heavy presence of indigenous people. So it certainly relates to the precise location of our church. And, you know, a couple of weeks ago, Curtis DeYoung from the Minnesota Council of Churches was talking about reparations. It even came up last week in Tom Weber's discussion. So this kind of thing is being talked about a lot more. And, you know, one of the things I did want to say is, you know, we kind of approach, as I think the Growth Task Force did, we approach this whole work from a sense of abundance, that we are a very wealthy church. We don't always feel that way. We sometimes have the scarcity mentality that we want to preserve what we have, and certainly churches like ours are struggling in many ways. Although we're doing relatively well right now, we really do want to approach this by saying, you know, we're a bastion of wealth in our neighborhood, and we do have a great deal we've been blessed in many ways, if you want to use that word. So it really makes looking at things like that, I think, quite possible. And actually, I think probably it's our responsibility to think about things like that.
Karen Barset is asking if we know anything about the prospective sale of the hardware store that's north of Groveland Avenue.
Karen, is there something specific you've heard about that recently? Or just kind of longer term rumors? I do know that I think it's John Marshall used to own that. He's passed away, and I've talked to his son, who's a developer, real estate developer, and they've always said that if they had an offer and were thinking of selling, they would always let us know first. I do know there's a new apartment building to the northeast of our property, about a block up, and there's another one planned on the other side, north side of the hardware store. And that developer is probably interested in the hardware store property, but I don't think there's anything in the works that I know of yet.
Hazel Lutz is asking about the food shelf. So originally intended to be temporary, but obviously it's not, and it's grown a lot over the last year, serving many more people than it used to. So is there any talk or thought in this about the food shelf possibly moving to a different location that would be designated specifically for the food shelf, and that would open up space for us?
Yeah, EJ is working with Groveland, I think, and EJ Kelly, and I had a conversation with him this week. They are looking at options outside of Plymouth, and we'll continue to work with them to see if there are any options within Plymouth too, because ideally we would like to keep that service within our church, but it needs to work for them first, both from a logistical standpoint and also an economic standpoint. So, you know, we would like to continue to partnership with them, but, you know, it's got to work for them. And so those discussions are underway.
And just a note from Gingy Ward, who's on the board for the food shelf, that they served 55,000 people there this year.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's up from 19,000 the year before, right? That's it's startling.
That's the kind of service you don't really want growth in, right? But thanks for the great work. That's awesome. Yeah.
A question from John Humphrey about, do we own the parking lot on the southwest corner of Franklin and Blaisdell?
No, we don't. We have a little over 2 acres of parking lots that we actually own. We have access to another 2 acres of parking, roughly. That parking lot, I think, belongs to the Park Nicollet Clinic over by the bank. So no, we don't own that one. We just use it.
My understanding is that it's just an agreement. They're doing that generously for us. Question about, do we know how many members presently live within walking distance of Plymouth?
I'm not aware of a number, no.
I know-
Depends on how far you can walk.
Yeah.
I know a few years back, we pulled some data about, I think we didn't really do it in terms of walking distance. I think we did a 3 or 4 mile radius. And it was a large percentage of people lived, maybe 50% lived within 3 or 4 miles of the church. And then, but I don't think we ever looked at it in terms of walking distance, but that's something, we could probably calculate that if we wanted to.
Mhm.
By zip codes. Just another comment about how the food shelf does bring the neighborhood into the church, and that's can be a positive thing. And so are we looking for other ways to bring the neighborhood in ways that would serve? So just clothing and health were the examples that John Humphrey is bringing in.
Yeah, I think that's clearly what we're trying to do, right? Is bring the neighbor, make everyone feel welcome on our campus, especially neighbors, in terms of needs, but also not just needs and service, but also just community activity and things like, when you have educational events and speakers on justice issues. So all kinds of things that we could have some health and wellness things too that are also important physically for people. So I think if anyone's seen the Growth Task Force document, there's a variety of different kinds of things we can do with our mission in the report and beyond that. So those are the kinds of ideas we're looking for, I think, as a church. So keep bringing up the ones that you think are really important. But service is obviously right at the top. But it's not all about service. It's also the community.
I'm sure Jackie will mention there is an adult forum, or there is a forum that's coming up in a few weeks on that growth task force that Lynn Moline will lead. So be sure you listen at the end for when that is coming up. I see a note from Gingy that we're using the building as a vaccine clinic, March 24th. I know we were working on that. I didn't, so it sounds like maybe that is confirmed. And then Mike McGinnigan, who chairs our Board of Finance and Administration, just a note here that over the next 1 to 3 years, there is about $500,000 of slated in needs for our HVAC, roof, and some other building repairs. And then we are doing the playground project that was voted on in the fall by the Deacons. So that will be changes to our campus and investments there. So do you see this as this project, Brian and Jeff, as sort of a series of smaller projects, or potentially some larger ones that would require more investment than what we would do in an annual budgeting process, I think is his point.
Oh, well, I'd say that Plymouth, the playground was not part of our work really. It was just, that was more of a safety issue that we had to address for our tenant. And obviously as a church, we want the kids to be as safe as possible. So I think our work as a church involves smaller short-term stuff that can have an impact immediately that doesn't cost a lot of money, like a lot of things we're currently working on, and others I hope too. But we will be looking at bigger questions. And I see Judy has a question about the parking lots, and yeah, how can we maintain the parking, but really maximize the use of that land for our mission? Could we, for instance, and this isn't anything we're planning, but could we do something like build affordable apartments on our parking lot, above the parking lot, so we still have the parking, but there's more affordable housing in our neighborhood for people who need it? Things like that, or a community health clinic, or, there could be all kinds of things. But that's up to us as a church to talk about and decide in the coming years. And I think that could lead to a capital campaign. There's no plan for that now, but in theory, of course, that could lead to that in a couple of years. And it's all what we decide to do as a church.
Jeff, you just mentioned affordable housing. The apartments that you mentioned that are down the street, a little north on Nicollet, are you aware, are either of those including an affordable housing component?
No, they're market rate, but I believe they're micro units, so they're on the lower end of market rates because they're smaller units. So, they're nice apartments. They're accessible pricing in that they're not luxury, but they're not legally affordable.
I'm just going to ask this group, just as a plea from somebody who's trying to watch multiple screens, if you have questions, would you mind putting them in the Q&A window? That'll just help us make sure we're monitoring all of those, capturing all of the comments. So just, you mentioned, Jeff, the playground relocation. This is a great chance to sort of recap what's going on with that playground and the location, sort of why we are choosing to do that, just to make sure the congregation knows what's going on there.
I know a little bit, but Brian, you might know more. Do you mind answering that?
Yeah, well, it was last year during the unrest that was happening in the city. There were some very dangerous situations. I think shots fired around our church, and I know Paula was out there, and other the daycare providers were out there, and they were taking cover. It was felt to be a safety issue having the playground in the location where it is. That it was on that side of the church. It created a safety issue for the children, and the school certainly felt that way. So that's where I think it started, that we really felt the need to look at the relocating the playground onto the south side of the church, facing Franklin Avenue. So that is my understanding of how that occurred. And maybe someone else might want to add to that.
It will connect the playground to the space that is used by not just our tenants, the childcare center, but also our own kids when they're using it. So it's being relocated right up against the classrooms. Yeah.
I think it used to be there, so I don't know when it moved to the other side, but
yeah,
it's just a safer area, more natural spot.
Okay. Let's see. So question, how has the preschool done through the pandemic? Do either of you want to answer that? Or
Well, generally, I can just say that I think they had some rent abatement to get them through last year. I think they started paying some rent, but maybe not full rent. But they really serve a good low-income group that we really want to support. And it seems to be a really well-run school. They were on the adult forum, I think, a month ago, and were really impressive. So we really value that highly as a church, I think. It's definitely part of our mission. And we definitely want to continue to work with them in a strong partnership.
They are paying full rent now.
Oh,
and
great.
they've actually asked for to expand some space. So they are planning to grow, and moving that playground was part of their decision.
Great.
Okay, so a question from Judy Takinen about if 50% of our property is in parking lots, how do we maximize or use these areas? Is there anything new you want to add to that?
Yeah, kind of address that a little bit, but I think we can build on top of the parking lots. And it's just, it's just a matter of if we want to build and what we build. But there are ways to maintain the parking, but still add some construction space if we need space for things like affordable housing or other things. So that can be part of our mission and our vision if we wanted to. And, we might not need quite as much parking as we've always had. There's street parking. We do have access to other parking lots in the area that we don't own, but we have access to them. So that's something we'll want to keep looking at too. But the point is, we don't want to just own land with parking lots that we use for 2 or 3 or 4 hours a week. If that land could be used and maximized by benefiting the neighborhood in other ways. I'm not minimizing the importance of parking, because convenient parking is very important for us as a church. So it's just that balance, I think.
It just FYI for people, the parking lot, we do rent out those spaces during the week. So it is a source of revenue for us. Question about the bullet point that you mentioned about potentially a multi-faith cultural center located within Plymouth. Is there any more background, any more information on that?
I would just say
point?
it's been an idea that just people have talked about over the last 3 or 4 years. I know Paula and Seth and other church members have just kind of, you know, at Plymouth, we have strong faith, but we also leave it to people to have their own individual specific beliefs, right? We don't have like a common faith that we all say, this is what we all believe. So we're open to people of other faiths. So that gives us the opportunity to welcome people of any faith that really care about the same things we care about, which is helping others, serving others, and working for justice in its many facets, and including spiritual wellness too, and self-care and wellness. So there are a lot of aspects to that. And I think that's a way that could be appealing to a lot of people in the neighborhood, not just people who specifically want to become members of our church, but we can serve the neighborhood by also providing, as I mentioned before, kind of educational and spiritual resources, quiet places to work and have coffee and study for students or workers, just a place to come together that's safe. A lot of the apartments too are small. And so people look for common areas where they can gather. Like, as you know, a lot of young people these days love to gather in coffee shops. So why not have them at Plymouth? And we have lunchtime speakers and they can listen in for 30 minutes to, what folks are doing on climate change in Minneapolis, things like that. So I think there's just lots of opportunities, and it takes all of our creativity coming together to really optimize that.
A question from John Humphrey. Had we identified potential Native American partners to develop the land that we might give or sell to them? Right.
No, at this point, John, no, we haven't, but we know where they are. I know there are people at Plymouth who do know those people. So that would definitely be something, that would be a next step in this process, is to start a conversation with them and approach it from a standpoint of how can we work together? What is it that you need? There's some development going on down Franklin Avenue in that regard, not ours certainly, but so there really is some interest in creating space and creating services and programs not too far from our church, and perhaps that's something we can help with. So we really would have to approach them with a great deal of humility and find out what they would need. So that is another next step.
And I would just add that reparations for Native Americans and Black Americans is something that's very top of mind for all of us. And everyone needs to get their ideas out there and be discussing this with your Plymouth friends, because we need to have this discussion as a church. I don't think there'll be any quick decisions, but I think over a couple of years we could talk about different options and come up with something hopefully that we all can be excited about. It could be related to land, it could be related to supporting organizations that are anti-racist or supportive of Native Americans. There are many ways, there are many forms reparations can take, but I think we're committed as a church. Our values are to recognize what's the damage that's been done in the past to Native Americans and Black Americans, and to repair that in some way. So that's definitely part of the discussion.
I think we're coming up at the end of our time. So on behalf of the three of us, I really thank everybody for all these great questions and comments. It's really exciting to be talking about something so future oriented and aligning it with our purposes. Jeff, Brian, do you want to add anything before we turn it back over to Jackie?
I would just add, I think it's exciting too, Claire, and there's great energy, and it's a way to really unify our church around some really strong values that we care a lot about, and can really bring people together, make us closer in our neighborhood, bring us closer as a city, and to repair some of these damages that have been done in the past. So I think it's a really positive discussion as a church we can have in the coming years. So we're really excited, and the timing is great with a new lead minister, and I think it's going to be really very exciting couple of years at Plymouth Church. So everybody's just got to be involved. There's no one group making this happen. It's everybody together. So thanks for the time today.
Yeah, I would just say that let's view this as both and. There's no reason why we can't do some great and bold things and not feel like we have to to jeopardize the financial security of the church. I think both things can occur, and we have to be very open to that. And as Jeff has said, we have to be very creative about it, but really willing to take those steps and really talk about them very openly.
Thank you all so much. This has been a very enlightening discussion, and we appreciate it. Next week, Elizabeth Glidden and Ann Manning will lead a discussion on reimagining community safety in Minneapolis. And we hope that you'll join us again then. Claire mentioned the Growth Task Force, and that will be, I think, presenting in the fall. So we'll keep you apprised of when that will be. And again, thank you ever so much for joining us, and have the rest of the day. Thank you.